So first, let me insist that everything I say today may be wrong. I've been a Quaker for 45 years. And I was excited to become a Quaker. They had a long history in social justice and fighting against slavery in the 18th century and the 19th century, and fighting for the equality of women in the 19th century, and opposing wars since the 17th century. But in the early 19th century, Quakers had an idea to sort of deal with the problem of corporal punishment, the violence and the abuse of corporal punishment, and thought that if offenders were put in kind of monastic cells and had the opportunity for sort of quiet reflection and meditation, they would be reformed. Well, these, of course, became the horrors we know as penitentiaries. That this well-meaning innovation that the Quakers brought has been a social nightmare. And so as a Quaker, let me in some sense apologize for our role in that, but also then to present this caveat that everything I say may be wrong. And the recommendation I make may be wrong, because I'm going to recommend some radical stuff. As we're thinking about this whole subject of behavioral and emotional health, I want to frame this in the context, most bluntly, of dehumanization. That white supremacy or white privilege, of course, is about dehumanizing another population. Our approach toward drugs and drug users is based on the dehumanization of drug users. When Dr. Beatty spoke about sort of the media representations and the association of drug abuse with African Americans, disproportionately, that serves a twofold purpose. Part of that is to further dehumanize African Americans, blacks. And this goes back 100 years. I mean, how many of you know about the origin of the federal narcotics prohibition in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act? A few hands, a few hands. So our drug laws are relatively modern. Drugs were not illegal. There's nothing in the Constitution about drugs. It's nothing, no power is given to Congress to regulate intoxicants per se, other than the alcohol amendments of the 20th century. But in the 1870s, as part of white labor reaction to Chinese immigration, Chinese coming into the country to work in mines, build railroads, do construction, compete with whites for jobs, a narrative was created that the Chinese were using opium to seduce white women, that the Chinese were dangerous, fiendish, evil, and the drug laws were created in part to reinforce that. At the beginning of the 20th century, how many of you are familiar with the movie Birth of a Nation, the original Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith? So this is a movie, one of the earliest motion pictures. It's considered absolutely foundational in the study of cinematography. And it is a movie which depicts sort of the situation in the South, that the freed slaves are these dangerous monsters who prey upon white women, and they are protected by the Ku Klux Klan. This is essentially the very short storyline, well depicted in a movie of about 1912 or 19. How many of you know when segregation was reintroduced into the federal cafeterias in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War? It was in 1913 when the new president of the United States, a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, orders the segregation of the lunchrooms. That in the early 20th century, as the freed slaves, their children and their grandchildren are acquiring some kind of economic power, property, training, education, they are increasingly seen as rivals to whites. In the early 20th century is when the Ku Klux Klan grew most dramatically. It was by the 1920s when the conclave in Kokomo, Indiana is held, and you have 1 million Ku Klux Klanners rally. You have Ku Klux Klan marching in Washington. The rise, the high point of lynching of blacks was in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, Americans were concerned with trade with China, just as we are concerned with trade with China now. There was the Boxer Rebellion. The Western powers had taken power in China. How many of you know that there was a war fought between Britain and China to protect the opium trade so that, that the British could bring Indian-grown opium to China and force its sale in China? And there were two wars fought called the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. Show of hands familiar on the Opium Wars. So the Chinese in part saw opium as a Western-imposed plague. In part of the Boxer Rebellion, there was a lot of anti-Western activity taking place in China. And for the Western powers to try to repair relations with the Chinese, there was the Shanghai Opium Commission in 1909, which said, we really should, the enlightened Christian Western powers should attempt to help address this problem. And the American delegation, which was led by an Episcopalian bishop, was alarmed that, in fact, America didn't have laws prohibiting and controlling these drugs on a national basis. And so when he returns from the conference in 1910, a bill was introduced by Congressman Foster to control the sale of narcotics at the federal level. Bill was defeated. The Southern Democrats were not about to start expanding more Yankee power. They had fought a whole war about Yankee power and the central government. This is interfering in the practice in medicine. This is interfering on states' rights. There's nothing in the Constitution about this. So in this period, so there was a reaction. Well, how do we pass this law? How do we overcome the opposition of our Southern Democratic opposition to this law? Political power changes. Democrats take control in the election of 1912. Woodrow Wilson becomes the president. But the narrative also is beginning to put out, the problem really is the crime of the blacks. So the chief of police in Atlanta testifies, that our crime problem is a problem of blacks using drugs, high on drugs. Drugs like cocaine make blacks into superhuman fiends. The only way you can stop them is you need bigger guns to shoot them. Our .32 caliber guns aren't big enough. We need higher caliber guns. We need like .38s and .45s to shoot the rampaging blacks high on cocaine. Cocaine is the cause, the cocainized Negro brain is the cause of the rape of white women in the South. It's blacks and drugs. And so when the law is brought forward in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act passes, banning heroin and cocaine in 1914. This is the origin, this is the political origin of the American drug policy. In the 1930s, with the economic competition for jobs, people whose farms are destroyed in the droughts in the Midwest, known as the Dust Bowl, desperate to find employment and jobs for their families, pack up and go to the promised land of California. Well, California, of course, had been settled by Spaniards, had been part of Mexico for hundreds of years until it was taken in the War of 1848 and becomes part of the United States. But people who occupied it, many of them, their families go back to Spain, and they've lived there the land has been granted them, they're farming. And if you have a white population coming in competing for the jobs, a narrative is created, that these people use a homicidal, dangerous drug called marijuana. And it's also these black musicians who are seducing white women and corrupting the culture, this, immoral music. And a narrative is created that lays the basis for the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. And deeply, based in race and economic opportunity. In the 1960s, as a heroin epidemic is growing. Now, the heroin epidemic was primarily in New York City and is blamed upon, John Lindsay, the liberal Republican mayor of New York, and his, the failure of New York City. But of course, one particular part that's often left out is the central role of entrenched police corruption in the NYPD. The heroin traffic was aided and abetted by the NYPD in the 1960s. And it is more a failure of our ability to properly manage the police in the 1960s, I would say, than liberal concepts of job development, of equal opportunity, public housing, and so forth. Again, I may be wrong. But the narrative around race becomes central to the vision of drugs. And so that when Nixon is talking about his anti-drug policies, he's quoted by his advisor, H.R. Haldeman, saying, well, you know, this is really about the blacks. And remember, there is enormous fear. There are race riots in the summers of 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. There's enormous violence. Crime rates have gone up. Young people seem to be acting up. Their campuses are in turmoil. There's opposition to the war in Vietnam. It looks like the wheels of the country are coming off. And a way in which to sort of blame this or attach it, this is drugs. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's pot, it's LSD, it's heroin. And this becomes part of a vision of the way the society is disorganized. It's a problem of drugs. Now, in the 1980s, by the 1980s, I was a young lawyer, and I was working for the US Congress in 1979. I was there when President Reagan was elected and the Senate was taken over by the Republicans. And I was there when Nancy Reagan was our first lady. I was there, you know, as we discovered people starting to die from this mysterious disease that we now know is to be, you know, AIDS. But in the 1980s, this was a very new phenomenon. I was there before there was crack. And crack in the 1980s was quickly framed as a black problem. It was an urban problem. So in the 1980s, when I was counsel to the House Judiciary Committee, I was centrally involved in the writing of the crack cocaine mandatory minimums of 1986. Those laws came out of my word processor in room 207 in the Cannon House Office building. I was at the table as these laws are hastily being written in partisan political objectives. But in the back of the mind is, this is a problem of blacks. How do we prevent this plague of crack to spread out into the white communities? Now, even at that time, the majority of crack users were white. The majority has always been white. It's an overwhelmingly majority white society. But the role was to create fear. And the role that drugs have played is to put a black face on the drug problem. And so we have, and so let me just give this kind of particular historical piece. How many of you know the criminologist Al Blumstein at Carnegie Mellon? I didn't expect you would, but past president of the American Society of Criminology, one of the most prominent criminologists. In 1973, he and Jacqueline Cohen did a paper called A Theory of the Stability of Punishment. And, you know, sort of Durkheim had argued that there, with, you know, in societies there's a steady kind of level of deviance, and Blumstein wanted to look a little further. Maybe it's about punishment. Can we see this? So he studies rates of incarceration in Norway and the United States. So in the United States, the data from 1920, imagine, I'm going to sort of walk along a timeline here. So 1920, he's able to begin to gather national rates of incarceration for the United States, and it's roughly 110 per 100,000. And now we have the whole 20s and the roaring 20s and alcohol prohibition, and then the 1930s, the depression, the crash, the unemployment. The rate of incarceration is still relatively level, you know, 110, 120 per 100,000. And so he publishes this paper in 1970. This is, you know, remember, we're talking about policies that are affected by police departments all around the country, judges all around the country, prosecutors all around the country. This, you know, you got thousands and thousands of different agencies involved, and you have this long level thing. And he theorizes, you know, this is a phenomenon. And it's similar in Norway. And this is what I theorize. The 1970 is essentially the climax of the civil rights movement. That up until that time, America had been segregated. You know, if you were black, there were all kinds of jobs you couldn't get. There were all kinds of neighborhoods you couldn't live in. You certainly couldn't travel freely around the country. You couldn't stay in hotels. You couldn't eat in certain restaurants. When that punishment for the status of being a deviant black and white America no longer exists as punishment, the punishment engine now focuses on the criminal justice system and focuses then on incarceration. Then in some sense, Blumstein is right. And the reason for this escalation, the role of it is to maintain white privilege in the society. And of course, as Dr. Beatty showed us in the data, the white youth start using drugs earlier, they use drugs more, they smoke twice as much, they use cocaine twice as much, they drink twice as much, they use hallucinogens twice as much as their black peers. But the role in our society of the drug problem is to put a black face on this problem. Drug users are dehumanized. And so we can do anything to them. So we can compel them into prison. We can compel them into treatment. We can say, you must go to AA meetings. You must go to spiritually based programs because we have the power to tell you that. I mean, even though if anybody said if you were not a person who was a drug user, they said, you must go to this spiritual program. Wait a minute, what about the First Amendment? Isn't the establishment of religion prohibited? What about free exercise of religion? Well, we think AA works. We think NA works. You're going to have to go. I want to see from your probation officer, you've gone. We're going to set up special courts. We'll call them drug courts, drug treatment courts. We're going to compel you into treatment. We don't compel the obese into treatment. We don't compel we don't compel anybody into treatment except drug users because we've dehumanized them. And the role of, and so it's broader than just the role of people of color now. Now we're faced with a overdose death epidemic unlike what we've seen. So when I started doing this work in the late 1970s, we had on the order of 7,000 drug overdose deaths a year. Now it's over 50,000. Now we asked the American people, is the war on drugs winning? No, it's not winning. But I want to ask you, you're all experts, you know about drugs. How many of you think we're winning, quote unquote, the war on drugs? How many think we're losing the war on drugs? Yeah, then how many of you say, I don't know, I don't like the question? All right, yeah, okay, they've got a number of hands, sure. And I wanted to make sure that you were recognized. We want to reduce the deaths from drugs. Is that a social goal? Of course it is. Should that be, imagine for a moment there was no drug law. Imagine this blank slate up here is the drug law. And somebody said, I want you to think of what our first priority, our very first priority of designing a drug law ought to be. How many of you would say, saving lives? Couple hands? Reducing deaths. That's not our first priority? Saving lives, I mean, to keep it simple, I think should be our top goal. And if that were our goal, look, we may not think drug users' lives are really worth saving unless we're talking about my cousin or my father. Or my son. One reason that there is now a revolution in drug policy is because so many people are dying, and they're not simply people on television. They're people related to us. They're my cousin who died from his Hep C, from when he was an injecting meth user in the 70s. How many people have someone in this room, someone they're related to who's died from a drug overdose or drug-related death? Yeah. Now, if our policy was to save lives, our policies would be completely different. We would teach drug users how to use drugs more safely. Now, drugs are dangerous. And many drug users' lives are hell. Our drug policies don't reduce the hell. If we believe that the only way to help drug users get better is make their lives work. Well, what does that say? I mean, you can say that. You know, I can only if I hit bottom am I going to seek recovery. Well, that's a view. And so for how many people is that bottom going to be? Death, or almost death. I approach, my value is that the lives of drug users need to be held up and honored as members of the community, as members of my family. I don't want a drug user treated any differently than my own kid, or my parent. But that's not the way we're functioning yet. It is critically important that people like you, who are concerned about this problem, speak out and make a part of your messaging, a part of your vision, that drug users' lives matter. They must be saved. They must be treated with respect. Drug users are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like the rest of us. And life means that the drugs that they have access to don't come from organized crime, that a drug user knows what they're getting, that they know what they're getting, and that the people who are selling to them are responsible and can be held liable for making sure it's of quality and of potency. Now, that does not mean that the drug users are going to manage their lives well, but it does mean that their risks of dying from overdose go down. We have the obligation to people to do this. Now, Virginia Beach, I know there's a beautiful ocean. There are lifeguards on the beach. Do the lifeguards discriminate and say, you know what? We don't save the people who get drunk and go out in the surf. We only save the good people. As a lifeguard, oh no, your life isn't worth saving. Or an EMT. Whoa, drunk driving accident, not my problem. We are very concerned generally about saving everybody's lives. And we need to think about what are the interventions that are going to save as many lives as possible. So we need to help, I believe, drug users who have problems with their drugs manage their addiction. We want them to be abstinent, but we're not going to insist upon it as a condition for providing help. We want them to be, but that's not a condition any more than saying to someone who's a patient for diabetes, I'm not treating you if you go off your diet. I'm not treating you, I'm not going to treat my cardiac patient unless you're not exercising. Oh, you stopped exercising, I'm kicking you out of my program. This dehumanization of drug users has, I think, its origin in the way in which our culture was able to dehumanize blacks, use them. The incarceration rate continues to remain high and continues to go up. We have a little marginal changes. There's a little more concern about treatment. But fundamentally, it's not different. So it doesn't keep drugs out of the hands of kids, so it's not protecting kids. Doesn't save lives, doesn't reduce crime. So what does it do? Why does it continue? What is its powerful function in the society? It protects the status quo, and the status quo is white privilege. Now, of course, there are the economic aspects. I stop a car with 3 teenagers, so we know what the data is. Lots and lots of people use marijuana in our society. If I stop 10 cars in the course of a shift, and I did a ride-along with our police and saw this, car gets stopped. Finally, we convinced, these young people, let us search the car. You got any drugs in the car? No, you mind if I look around? Oh, well, it's this, okay. Couple of busts, okay, call for backup. 4 officers are now on the scene. They're all in the report. They're all now going to show up because they're on the police report. They all get 3 hours of overtime every time they show up. It's called collars for dollars. Seize the vehicle. Forfeiture money goes to help pay for the police department training retreat, in Las Vegas or wherever they do the training program at. So this is my takeaway. We must think about what we're doing as a matter of policy. How do we save drug users' lives? And if that's at the top of our agenda, that means safe consumption, safe access to drugs. It means recognizing that the public health interventions, all of the excellent interventions that Dr. Beatty talked about, labeling. You can't have labeling that's honest. Nobody puts warning labels on their heroin. Of course, the access that we have, there is no point in doing enforcement when the drugs are illegal. When the drugs are legal, then you can do enforcement. You can't enforce against a criminal regime. All you're doing is creating job opportunities. And so that's what I ask you to take away with you, is save drug users' lives. That's the top goal. Design your policy as though you're trying to save your own kid's life. Would you want your kid to go to jail? Do you think that's good? Do you think your kid should inject dope from the street? That's our policy. Should your kid have to become a prostitute because she can't afford her dope? That's our policy. The prices are created by our policy. That's why they're expensive. Drug users are entitled to life, and they're entitled to liberty. Well, thank you very, very much.